Good evening. We're going to have the guys pass out some handouts for you. Hopefully it'll be helpful as we make our way through the material tonight. You can tell from the subtitle there that we're going to be looking at C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. And some of you may have read all these before. Some of you may have been sometime since you've done that. Others of you may have just heard of them or kind of know about them. Maybe even seen one of the movies that was released a decade or so ago. What I'd like to do is take us through three key stories that reflect different perspectives on what it means to have a transformed life and how it ties in not only with the fiction of the stories that Lewis wrote, but also a few passages from his nonfiction and from Scripture about how all this might tie together. To do that, I'd like to start with just a little bit of brief background on the series. You see there, they're put in the order in which most people may have been familiar with them and when they were published, but if you look there, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, The Horse and His Boy, Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. For those that have read them in depth, you know The Magician's Nephew, the sixth book of the series, actually is like the backstory. It's the prequel that shows how all things were created, how Narnia itself was formed, and how anyone from our world got to know anything about Narnia. The most popular one, of course, is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And what you find, of course, there is the story that's primarily a narrative that helps us understand Aslan as a kind of Christ who offers himself and offers a sacrifice of his own life in order to spare another. Then Prince Caspian follows shortly after that, and Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But that fifth book, The Horse and His Boy, is actually kind of a follow-up on The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe because the young children are kind of a little more grown and they're reigning at that time. And then The Silver Chair we'll look at some today, and The Last Battle. The ones we will examine in some capacity tonight, though, are The Magician's Nephew, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and The Silver Chair. They've not made movies yet about all of these. I hear there's a series in the making, but we'll look at just one clip from The Voyage of the Dawn Treader here in just a little while. I'd like to start with this story, The Magician's Nephew, and we're going to focus on the character of Uncle Andrew. And he is not an example of a transformed life. In fact, quite the opposite. He gives us an example of what it means for someone to have a life that appears to be untransformable. We'll consider what that might mean. And you see the image there of a bizarre-looking Uncle Andrew, and then an image of Aslan in the moment of creation. The short version of it is that the first entry into Narnia happened because there were magic rings that were made by Uncle Andrew, who was sort of an amateur scientist, magician, supposedly, according to the story Lewis tells, descended from Morgan Le Fay, and that there was some sort of magic in his life, in his history, right? So these magic rings take them to a world between the worlds, and this wood between the worlds is the place where they can access any place, and by happenstance, they find themselves in a pool that leads them to Narnia. Again, I won't go through all the details, but the short version of it is the kids magically find themselves in this world that is in the process of being created. They have no idea where they are. They don't know what's going on. And they eventually meet Aslan as he is bringing everything to life there. And here, Aslan is presented as the creator. And that's the key scene we're going to look at. It's also the story where, toward the end, as Diggory has a mother who is quite ill, just as Lewis himself lost his mother as a young child, he gives us the character of Diggory, and it's a magic apple from Narnia that he returns to England with that actually saves his mother's life. And upon sharing the apple with her, he plants the core of the apple out of the yard. That tree eventually grows into a wonderful, magnificent tree that eventually falls in a storm, and he takes the wood from that tree and makes a wardrobe out of the tree, and that becomes the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So let's look at this scene where, in The Magician's Nephew, they're all there, creation is happening, Aslan is making it happen, and Andrew is going to witness this. Here's the beginning of it. The voice on the earth was now louder and more triumphant, but the voices in the sky, after singing loudly with it for a time, began to get fainter. And far away, and down near the horizon, the sky began to turn gray. A light wind, very fresh, began to stir, and the sky in that one place grew slowly and steadily paler. You could see shapes of hills standing up dark against it, and all the time the voice went on singing. The voice rose and rose till all the air was shaking with it, and just as it swelled to the mightiest and most glorious sound it had yet produced, the sun arose. The earth was of many colors. They were fresh, hot, and vivid. They made you feel excited until you saw the singer himself, and then you forgot everything else. And so it's a beautiful picture of earth, this Narnia being created by the God figure in the story, Aslan, through song. And you wonder how many times maybe Lewis and Tolkien had maybe talked about this possibility, because Tolkien tells it the same way in his story world, that all things were made through the song of the great ones who brought it to being. So in this scene, everyone is fascinated by this music, this song that brings all things to life, except the evil witch, the same witch that's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Uncle Andrew. It makes her angry, but she knows its power, and that's what angers her. It's a power that she doesn't possess. Andrew has no clue what it is, who it is, how it is. He has no way of understanding it. And so the first passage here in the handout is the narrator, Lewis, I guess, telling us that Andrew had no idea what was going on. And that's the first quote. You know, what you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. And so he's making a point about perspective, and perspective matters, certainly. We all know that's true if we're ever in some disagreement with someone, if it helps to see things from their perspective, but he's saying something more than that. It depends on what sort of person you are. What kind of lens are you using? How has your vision been clouded or affected or otherwise shaped by the way that you are? Not just by the way the world is, but by the way you are. And that's why I kind of wanted to talk about Andrew for a while, because his way of understanding was darkened by his way of being. And so when something new was presented to him, he had no way to process it in a way that would transform him. And there's a passage in Scripture about that we'll get to in just a moment. So now it's everybody else watching. And one of the characters who was sort of pulled into Narnia was a cabbie from London, and it's describing him there along with the two children that have been pulled in as well. The cabbie and the two children had open mouths, shining eyes. They were drinking in the sound. They looked as if it reminded them of something. Uncle Andrew's mouth was open too, but not open with joy. He looked more as if his chin had simply dropped away from the rest of his face. His shoulders were stooped, and his knees shook, and he was not liking the voice. If he could have got away from it by creeping into a rat's hole, it's a curious way to imagine that, a rat's hole, of all places for him to go, he would have done so. But the witch looked as if, in a way, she understood the music better than any of them. Her mouth was shut, her lips were pressed together, and her fists were clenched. Ever since the song began, she had felt that this whole world was filled with a magic different from hers and stronger. She hated it. There's two things that come to mind when I read that passage. It makes me think of those demons that Christ encountered as he was going around healing. They knew who he was. What do you want with me, Son of God? And they immediately recognized the power that the people were still trying to process. Prophet? Elijah? One like the one prophesied? The Messiah? They couldn't make sense of it either. But those demons knew exactly who it was. And here we have a witch who knew something of this power enough to fear it and hate it. But I'm also reminded here of the story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Those of you that are familiar with it, you recall that part of what made Aslan's sacrifice so effective is that it was part of a deeper magic that went well beyond the witches. And that's kind of hinted at here. Now, when the lion had first begun singing, our next long passage, long ago when it was still quite dark, he had realized that the noise was a song, that is Andrew. He could tell it was a song. And he disliked the song very much. It made him think and feel things he did not want to think and feel. Then when the sun rose and he saw that the singer was a lion, only a lion, as he said to himself, he tried his hardest to make believe that it wasn't singing and never had been singing. This man of reason, science, was making believe that what he was seeing with his own eyes and hearing with his own ears wasn't what he was seeing and hearing. He couldn't handle empirical evidence in this moment, and he had to have a different kind of faith that took him out of that reality just so he could be okay with it. Only roaring as any lion might do in a zoo in our own world. Of course, it can't really have been singing, he thought. I must have imagined it. I've been letting my nerves get out of order. Who ever heard of a lion singing? And the longer and more beautiful the lion sang, the harder Uncle Andrew tried to make himself believe that he could hear nothing but roaring. Now, the trouble about trying to make yourself stupider than you really are is that you very often succeed. There's Lewis sticking one in there. Uncle Andrew did. He soon did hear nothing but roaring in Aslan's song. Soon he couldn't have heard anything else even if he'd wanted to. And when at last the lion spoke and said, "Narnia, awake," he didn't hear any words he heard only a snarl. And when the beasts spoke in answer, he heard only barkings, growlings, bayings, and howlings. And when they laughed, well, you can imagine. That was worse for Uncle Andrew than anything he had happened yet. Such a horrid, bloodthirsty din of hungry, angry brutes he'd never heard in his life. And then, to his utter rage and horror, he saw the other three humans actually walking out into the open to meet the animals. He can't even make sense of how other people are responding to it. You see the kind of almost the allegory he's painting here, Lewis is painting, of how people respond to spiritual realities. Some people don't want to confront them, want to believe anything else but the idea that they might be true, and are convincing themselves that they couldn't possibly be true. And then when they see other people responding to it in love and faith and adoration, praise, they can't make sense of that either. And they would rather distance themselves from those people, maybe even hate those people too. You see, he's sort of making commentary on the world itself. Now, when the people, the young men, girl and boy, ask Aslan about their Uncle Andrew, is there anything we can do for him? Aslan says, he's thinking great folly, child, because one of the things that Andrew had done, you might recall also from the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, that there was the lantern waste, and there's a lantern with a light that never seems to go out. Well, that lantern also came from this story. As they're leaving Earth and making their way into Narnia, that witch had wrenched loose a piece of a light pole, and she had it with her, and she actually had thrown it at Aslan in anger. It hits his forehead, doesn't interrupt his singing a bit, and falls to the ground. But because everything was so fertile and full of life and coming into being, that one little bit of post became its own post, right? A little playfulness of Lewis's part here to kind of back up how that lamppost got there in the first place. But you see here, Andrew had thought, well, if we can just go back and forth between these worlds, I can go get some stuff, bring it here, and multiply it, and I could be a rich man. And he just has all these imaginings about how he can use this world rather than be instructed by it, or whether be changed by it. He's just going to use it, because that's how he is. He's a user. He makes use of everything and everyone to get what he wants for himself. So, Aslan says, he's thinking great folly, child. This world is bursting with life for these few days because the song with which I called it into life still hangs in the air and rumbles in the ground. It will not be so for long. But I cannot tell that to this old sinner, and I cannot comfort him either. He has made himself unable to hear my voice. If I spoke to him, he would hear only growlings and roarings. Oh, Adam's son, how cleverly you defend yourself against all that might do you good. And this might remind us of Christ weeping outside Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. What are you thinking? You stone the prophets, kill those sent to speak to you and to save you. They just can't accept what they're being told, what they're being shown, what they're being called to. And for Uncle Andrew, it's easier to just shut it out, disbelieve it, bury his head in the sand, so to speak. If you know the story, that's pretty much what he does, or it has happened to him. In this story, Lewis is giving us a character who can't be changed. The last story in the series, The Last Battle, does the same thing, but he uses the dwarves in that case to be unwilling to listen and answer. And there's a scene where the dwarves are on the precipice of entering into paradise, but they want nothing to do with it. They're in the stable where they're all waiting, and they're being offered real food, and they believe that they're being offered filth. They just can't see things for what they really are. And they're blinded, and it's a metaphor being played out by their characters. And Lewis does it a couple of times in this whole series to show us what it's like when somebody completely shuts themselves off to the voice of God, to the reality of God. The next story is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And here's a pretty familiar story. Those of you who've seen the movie especially, you might recall the character of Eustace. The short of it is that Eustace is a punk. He's a toad. He's annoying. The opening line of the book is, there once lived a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it because he lives up to that name. And his cousins don't like him. He's a cousin to the children who grew up with the story of Narnia and had lived it in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So Eustace makes fun of them. Eustace doesn't believe them about all these stories. He makes fun of them for making up fake stories. He's a man of science himself. He likes animals, but especially when you can pin them to something and describe them in a book about animals. He would dissect and he would study, but he would not cuddle or love. That's not in him at the beginning of the story, right? Well, as they make their way through this narrative, They find themselves once more in Narnia. Here is King Caspian there, along with Edmund and Lucy, who stumble in, along with Eustace. Eustace is kind of accidentally brought into the story. And we'll come back to this at the end, but we have the four Pevensey children. Each of them, Peter, Susan, Edmund, Lucy, it was like they belonged in Narnia. And after a while, their time in Narnia comes to a close. But they bring Eustace in, and later Eustace will bring Jill in. And it's as if these children need something that they're not getting anywhere else. Not from their parents, not from their life, not from their experience. And they need Narnia. We'll come back to that in a bit. But Eustace didn't know anything about it, didn't want anything to do with it, and yet he found himself there. Kind of like Andrew. Similar kind of situation. They fall through a magic painting into the world of Narnia in the ocean as Caspian is sailing eastward, because 7 lords who'd been faithful to his father were exiled when there was an usurpation and his father was thrown off the throne. And so now he's going to try to find those lords and recover them, and perhaps even just honor their fallen bodies. But Eustace is in this journey with them, and he stumbles upon a treasure as he wanders off by himself one day on one of the islands that they come across. And when he finds this treasure, he didn't read the right books as a child to know that it was a dragon's treasure, and he should be pretty careful about this, and it's often cursed, and he needs to be quite mindful of that. But he never read the right kinds of stories, Lewis tells us. And Lewis is almost telling us, if you're familiar with Harry Potter, Eustace is a muggle, and he doesn't know anything about the kind of other world of spirit and experience that goes beyond the physical and what can be tasted or touched or measured somehow. And what we find here is Eustace not being prepared for the reality he's going to encounter by all the things that he should have learned by now. And he's going to once more kind of use a different sort of lens and get it wrong. And so he finds this treasure, and he wants to take it for himself. And one of the treasures he takes for himself is an armband. He puts it all the way up, and when he wakes up from a nap, he wakes up as a dragon. And that band is clasped tight around his dragonish little arm, right? So it's fantastical, it's strange, it's bizarre, but this cursed treasure has cursed Eustace to become the kind of creature that only covets for itself. Right? That's what the dragon's doing with the horde in the first place. And Eustace has to communicate with the others. He kind of scratches in the sand and makes it clear that he is, in fact, Eustace, not just a dragon. And at first, they're all freaked out by the fact that a dragon is upon them, but he helps them. And later, he will comment, I think I was a better dragon than I was a boy. But he comes to understand a little bit more about who he is and who he wants to be, and that's the importance of this story here with Eustace. As he is the dragon, it's time for him to be undragoned, as Edmund calls it. And Eustace is describing to Edmund how it happened. How did you become a boy again? What happened? And he describes the encounter with Aslan. And he says, well, he, meaning Aslan, peeled the beastly stuff right off. All the scales that had been his as a dragon were peeled right off. And there was I, as smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I had been. And then he caught hold of me. I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now that I had no skin on. And he threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. And then it became perfectly delicious. And as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm, and then I saw why. I had turned into a boy again. And so in the book version, we have a scene that's pretty much like a baptism scene, that he comes back to the Lord, to Aslan. Aslan comes to him, in fact, and restores him to the life he's supposed to have. But it's now as someone who's been changed by the reality of his beastliness. He had to come and confront how beastly he had been. And, that's an expression in sort of British English anyway, to behave in a beastly way. And he even uses that term. And I think it's meant quite literally. The idea that he had behaved in this way as to how he became the dragon. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. And then this is the other description of him trying to do it himself. Before he surrendered to Aslan and let Aslan peel it off and wash him clean, he says, I had started scratching myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. But just as I was going to put my feet in the water, I looked down and saw that they were all hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly, just as they had been before. And then the lion said, I don't know if it spoke, you'll have to let me undress you. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And so part of this is Lewis telling us, how many times have we tried to remove our own scales? to imagine that we were capable of changing ourselves into who we're meant to be in Christ. And we have to let him do it. He has to do the work of transformation. And every time we try, we only scratch the surface. We don't dare go deep enough. But he goes all the way to the heart. Now, it would be nice and fairly nearly true, Lewis tells us, that after all this, that Eustace had from that time forth been a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he began to be a different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be quite tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice. The cure had begun. And that idea of the cure is a very old one. You know, St. Augustine had said that the church is really a hospital filled with those who are all recovering from a long illness. And here, Lewis is telling us that the cure had begun in Eustace. And it only happened because through the magic of this place, through the wonder of Narnia, through the work of Aslan, Aslan let him be who he already had been all this time. All right, have your way. You can be a dragon. But now let me have my way and undragon you and let you become the real you you're meant to be that you could only see after you had gone through all that. He needed that kind of perspective first before he could really accept it. So here's a passage from Titus 3 there on your handout. At one time, we too were foolish, disobedient, deceived, and enslaved by all kinds of passions and pleasures. We lived in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another. Quite dragonish. But when the kindness and love of God our Savior appeared, he saved us, not because of righteous things we'd done, but because of his mercy. He saved us through the washing of rebirth and renewal by the Holy Spirit, whom he poured out on us generously through Jesus Christ our Savior, so that having been justified by his grace, we might become heirs, having the hope of eternal life. In a way, this is all our story, and that's what Paul is saying. We've all gone through something like this experience that Eustace has. It's easy through the work of fiction to sort of be annoyed at him and be sort of frustrated with him, and to yet still enjoy, of course, the fact that he doesn't stay that way, and that story doesn't have to end that way. It doesn't have to go that way. He can be changed, he can be transformed, but it appears maybe only if he fully realizes what he's become and fully allows the work of God to be upon him. Here's the clip from the film that shows us how the film tries to render this. They couldn't quite have a dragon be undragoned by the ripping claws of a lion and become a boy. That would be pretty dramatic and get a PG-13 rating pretty quickly. So they had to find a way to kind of animate this for us. As you think about it, throughout the story, the roar of the lion, sorry, I'm going to go back to this. The roar of the lion appears in lots of moments throughout the story series, and I think it's probably a fitting way to render when Aslan is ready to do his greatest work, right? In this moment, even the scratching on the sand isn't enough, but the fullness of that roar is really an expression of God's desire to really have us become who we're meant to be. And I appreciate it, even though it's totally different. We lost the whole baptism scene. I'm bummed about that. But what we do get is a dramatization of what it looks like when we see the passion of the Christ figure in the story wanting to make us who we're meant to be and to remove from us everything that is destroying us. This is the desire of God. Now, notice this quotes from Mere Christianity from Lewis. And he uses this imagery in all of his nonfiction as well. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. And a dragon is a symbol of a hellish creature. It's in Revelation, right? And so here he's using this symbol, this idea in the story to show us someone whose choices turned him quite dramatically into a hellish creature. But by the grace of God, expressed through the character of Aslan, he can become who he's meant to be, a heavenly creature, as one who is filled with the life of God instead. But it's a really fascinating idea, and Lewis always has a way with words. But we think of dramatic transformations, and we think of people being great, but notice how Lewis says we might simplify it too much when we imagine only the spectacular or the miraculous or the immediate as the work of God or the terror of tragedy. It often happens slowly, bit by bit, choice by choice, and we're turning the central part of who we are, the part that chooses, into something that is either more like Christ or less like Christ. Fallen man, he says, is not simply an imperfect creature who needs improvement. He's a rebel who must lay down his arms. Laying down your arms, surrendering, saying you're sorry, realizing that you've been on the wrong track and getting ready to start a life over again from the ground floor, it means unlearning all the self-conceit and self-will that we have been training ourselves into for thousands of years. It means killing part of yourself, undergoing a kind of death, almost like a claw that reaches all the way to your heart, that you're surrendering to the work of God, to undergo a kind of death, to be done with the old self that you had made, to become the new self that Christ has made. Elsewhere, he says that Christ tells us, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self. I have come to kill it. No half measures are any good. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent as well as the ones you think wicked, the whole outfit, and I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own will shall become yours. And that's the kind of transformation that Lewis pictures for us in these stories. The last one is the silver chair. And the silver chair features the story of Prince Rilian. And the short version of this is the young prince of Narnia was kidnapped. He was lost. No one knew where he was. And when the children make their way into Narnia this time, they're told, you've got to go help find the prince and get him back. They don't know quite how to do that. They have to follow all kinds of directions, and they have to learn a lot along the way. But they eventually find the prince, and he is sort of imprisoned in this underworld, kind of a cave-like world beneath the surface of the world. And in this place, he has been convinced that he is the Black Prince, and that 23 hours of the day, he's fine. But 1 hour of every day, he's enchanted. And the cure for this, he is told by the witch, who pretends to be a queen, is to sit in this chair, to be bound with ropes, and for her magic to work upon him. And she will make sure that he is safe during this hour of enchantment. But the truth is, he's been captured and enslaved, and he is enchanted 23 hours of every day, and is only in his right mind 1 hour of every day. And she binds him to that chair to keep him confused, to keep him from not realizing the truth about his imprisonment. And so it's a fascinating way that Lewis tells the story to once more show us what it's like when we don't realize how we've been bound by lies. Right? So in this story, they make their way into the kingdom and eventually come across the Lady of the Green Kirtle, who again is really an evil witch who pretends to be a lady. She's actually the queen of the Underland. And this is about the silver chair that he's bound to and the enchantment that must be broken. Here is his description. Every night I am saying, if only I could get out of this enchanted chair, it would last. I should be a man again. But every night they bind me, and so every night my chance is gone. It is at this hour that I am in my right mind. It is all the rest of the day that I am enchanted. But this is clarity of thought. And then when he kills it, when he destroys the chair upon being freed from it by the children, it says, as the chair broke, there came from it a bright flash, a sound like a small thunder, and for a moment, a loathsome smell. Lie there, vile engine of sorcery, he said, lest your mistress should ever use you for another victim. And so this whole story is about someone who, for almost all of his life, 24 of his life, He is made to believe that he is fine and that only 1 hour of his life is a mess and that needs to be fixed somehow. When the truth is, only 1 hour of his life truly is a moment of clarity. And she continues to confuse him and beguile him and to keep him lost in this place where she's kept him bound. Now, on the handout, when the spell is broken, he says, "For now that I am myself, I can remember that enchanted life, though while I was enchanted, I could not remember my true self." He couldn't remember who he really was. That enchantment, its greatest power, wasn't just to make him stay away from where he belonged, but was primarily to make him not know who he really is. And that kept him from going to where he truly belonged. This enchantment is not unique to this story. Lewis is telling us that all of us, in a way, are being bound by an enchantment that makes us think that real life, that true life, that good life is a life that has nothing to do with the reality of God. And that anyone who thinks that must be under some other kind of spell, and it must be hindered, it must be broken, it must be restrained. And so the idea is that Prince Rilian's story is the story of all of us who at some point break free from that enchantment and realize that we have been lied to and we have lived a lie most of our lives. And it's only through such power that we can break the spell. He tells the queen, second quote there, "I am king's son of Narnia, Rilian, the only child of Caspian, 10th of that name, whom some call Caspian the seafarer. Therefore, madam, it is my purpose, as it is also my duty, to depart suddenly from your highness's court into my own country." "Narnia," she said. "Narnia? I've often heard your lordship utter that name in your ravings. Dear prince, you're very sick. There's no land called Narnia." She wants to convince him that the truth about where he belongs isn't even real. There isn't some special place where you belong. The witch queen then says, "Well, you see, when you try to think out clearly what the sun must be," because they said, "We've got to get out of here. We've got to see the sun again." "Well, what is the sun?" They tried to explain it. "It's like a lamp." And she said, "Oh, I see. You can only tell me that it's like the lamp. Your sun must be a dream. There's nothing in that dream that wasn't copied from the lamp. The lamp is the real thing. The sun is but a tale, a children's story. Now come, all of you, put away these childish tricks. I've worked for you in the real world," her world. "There's no Narnia, no overworld, no sky, no sun, no Aslan." So she's convinced them that there's nothing else but this place, and there can't be another alternate world where such realities could possibly exist. As they struggle to escape this spell that she's trying to cast on them, Puddleglum, their little friend who's helped them through all their adventures, says, "Okay, suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees, grass, sun, moon, stars, Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia." He's convinced that what he knows deep down to be true must be true, even if everything else makes it feel like it's not. Now, when they eventually make their way out of this place, they've freed the prince and they've got to escape the underworld. They go through a moment where they're not quite all the way out, and they kind of find themselves kind of on the edge between the underworld and the real world, and it happens to be a cave-like place. When Jill woke the next morning and found herself in a cave, she thought for one horrid moment that she was back in the underworld. But when she noticed that she was lying on a bed of heather with a furry mantle over her and saw a cheery fire crackling as if newly lit on a stone hearth, and further off, morning sunlight coming in through the cave's mouth, she remembered all the happy truth. There's a lot going on here, and most of it has to do with Plato's allegory of the cave. It's an old story that Plato's teacher told to try to explain how education works. And it's as if, I almost called him Aslan, it's as if Lewis put it all right here in this moment, that moment between leaving the darkness and emerging into the real life where they belong in Narnia. They're right on that precipice, trying to escape and trying to make their way onward. And he puts Jill in the cave. And there's a fire in this cave, and there's sunlight coming in. Well, that's exactly what happens in Plato's allegory of the cave. This is an artist's rendering of it. As you see there in this allegory, Plato says, imagine this cave where a good deal of people, most of the people in the cave are all in the back of it, all in the darkest part of it, all facing the back wall and chained to the back wall, unable to escape. They're prisoners there. And they've been there, according to this allegory, all their lives. They've never left it. And the only thing they know, and you see at the top right of this image, the only thing they know are the shadows cast on the wall. They don't know how the shadows got there. They don't know who made them or how they were made. They don't even know what they really are. They don't know what the objects are that are casting those shadows, much less about the fire that is making it possible. They've only seen from the back of the wall that they're chained to the back of the wall of the entire cave. He says, imagine though, if someone could leave that collection of prisoners and maybe come to understand more about what's in the cave. And he sees here in this image someone trying to talk to them about what's on the other side. They would realize that the fire at the middle of the cave is the light that makes the objects along that wall cast shadows against the back wall of the cave. And that these people who've only known shadows have no conception of the reality of the entire cave, much less any conception at all that there's a world outside that cave. And so it's Socrates' way of saying most people are confused about the world and how it works. In terms of proportion, most people never get it. There's a kind of elitism about education here, but in his day it's true, and in our day it's probably true if you think about global population. Most people don't have an opportunity for a good education. Most people, if we spiritualize this allegory, most people have not encountered the light of God as they can or should. And according to this allegory, he says some people will be sort of in that middle space around the fire, and they'll be kind of talking about what's been happening. They might try to go even further because there's diffused sunlight coming through what might be called the entrance or the exit of the cave, depending on which direction you're headed. And outside the cave is the true sun. The light from the fire is only a picture of the true sun. And so this whole dialogue in the silver chair is Lewis putting the allegory of the cave right in the middle of his book. And he says, down in the underworld, the queen's magic is to make people think that the cave is the only world, that there's nothing outside the cave. In fact, she's trying to convince them that the back of the cave is the only world. And that the only way they know anything about this sky or this sun is that they've taken something they know and they've just extrapolated it into something that must be better somehow, but not real. Even Aslan, she says, well, you've only seen a small cat, and you just imagine there must be a lion. Completely reversing reality. And in the allegory, the sun that's outside the cave is supposed to represent truth. And any experience with light at all, whether that's from the light of the fire or the light outside the cave, any experience with light at all is a kind of growth, is a kind of understanding. And the trouble is, anytime you flip on a light after you've been asleep, it's painful. And he says it's hard for people to learn something new. They will resist it. In fact, he says the people who are at the back of the cave, if you try to convince them to come with you, they would not be willing to do so. They might even resist with violence if possible. And as I tell my students many times, think about the people who have tried to come and tell people that everything they know and see is wrong. Think about the prophets. Think about Christ. Think about anyone like Dr. King. Anyone who's tried to say the way we're doing this is all wrong, the people of this world usually kill them. They will resist with violence when they're told that everything they know to be true is not true. And so in this allegory that Lewis knew inside and out, the idea is people are stuck in the cave and they don't know it. And if you try to show them they're stuck in the cave, they won't be willing to listen, not for a while yet. But you can hope that you can take them with you. And if you can show them the truth in all of its reality. The tendency is, though, if you glance up at the top left of this image, the tendency is for those who have seen the light fully outside in the sun, they're tempted to keep their little small group of understanding to themselves. They will hesitate to go back into the cave and try to help anybody else. And he uses it to say that some people tried to, of course, not share in the suffering of other people, but he's talking about it primarily, in his case, in the instance of politics. That people who know what is true and good and just and right, they often resist getting involved in the mess of politics because it's so complicated. And they would rather just keep it to themselves. But he says, I wish this were relevant to our day, if the people who know the best about what is good stay out of politics, what are you going to get? And he says, the worst thing you could have is a place that's run by people who desperately want to run this place. You need people who would hesitate to do so. But all of this to say, for centuries, we've been telling ourselves a story like this, that it is easy to be confused about what's true and easy to believe a lie, hard to change, hard to accept that what you've always thought really isn't true. And they need to see everything from a completely different perspective. Conversion, transformation is a challenge. And in this story, Rillian has the spell broken and he can see clearly enough to escape. So look at the last couple of passages there. 2 Corinthians 4. This is the one that applies to Andrew. It applied to Eustace for a time. It applied here to these characters for a time as well. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, and what is unseen is eternal. And that was the problem. Part of what was happening in that cave is she was not willing to let them believe in anything they couldn't see at that moment. And they resisted to the point of pain in Puddleglum's case to make sure he held on to that belief, even if he couldn't see it for himself. And so it's a question of faith, it's a question of truth, and it's a question of deceit and of enchantment. They were enchanted to believe that everything they knew to be true wasn't true. And according to the story of Rillian, too many of us live our whole lives believing that lie, just needing to be freed from it. And his story is an example of escape. Here is Lewis's kind of last word on the matter. The instrument through which you see God is your whole self. And if a man's self is not kept clean and bright, his glimpse of God will be blurred. This might remind you of the words of Jesus. The eyes are the lamp of the body. And if it's no good, how dark it must be. But who we really are is the lens through which we see things. Again, return to this passage about Andrew. What you see and what you hear depends a great deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. Those who've seen the light and know what's real and true, according to this allegory, they've got to get back in there, help those who are still bound and ignorant and confused. Stories like these, they can do the work of Plato's allegory. Because they're not real in the same sense that you and I and what you just did or said is real, but they're real in the sense that they're telling truths that our world often doesn't tell. That our world is often a world of enchantment, is fooling people about what's really real and truly true. But good stories, true stories, can awaken us to truths that the world will never tell us. Good stories can do the work of Plato's allegory, curing readers of illusions and calling them out of the darkness. And of course, the gospel itself does this every time. Here's the moment from the silver chair that Jill is trying to explain what it was like to be enchanted for a moment when she was almost believing that the witch was telling the truth. At this time, it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted. For now, the witch's magic was in full strength. And of course, the more enchanted you get, the more you feel that you are not enchanted at all. That's what had happened to Rillian. The more enchanted he was, the more he began to feel that he was not enchanted at all. And that's the trouble in our world, that we and so many others like us get to the point where the part of our lives that is false and bad and unhealthy and unchristlike, we've gotten so used to it that it doesn't seem wrong to us at all. And it's not a part of us that we are allowing to be subject to the work of Christ, to peel away. It's a layer we are not exposing to his work. And in every sense, the idea is enchantment's not just in fairy stories. Lewis uses these stories to show us and remind us how enchanted our world can be at times and how enchanting it can be when we believe things to be false that are true and things that are true to be false. Ultimately, all these stories show us different examples of what it's like for someone to be open to such truths or to have closed himself off entirely to being able to hear it or recognize it or accept it at all. And then those like Eustace, Rillian, who are so glad finally to have been freed from what they hadn't realized they'd been bound by. In each case, they didn't know what had been happening to them. He didn't realize just what a twerp he was until Eustace became a dragon and wanted to change, but he couldn't change himself. And Rillian was enchanted so badly that he had no idea that he was enchanted that badly until he was freed, until he could see clearly. And once he could see clearly, and know God fully, then he could be transformed. Then he could be free.